I've been getting a lot of questions lately about vertical bridles versus baskets or rope, chain, straps, any of those kind of things when you have a single strand versus if you double it up. And the principle is that doubled up is twice the strength of vertical. But there's a lot of redneck inside of everybody that sees the single point of rope here where the load's connected, and they say to themselves that it can't be twice the strength because there's only a single piece of rope at that connection point. But what we're going to do today is talk about it. We'll talk about the physics of it, and then we've got a demonstration to show and prove that it does double the strength of it. So what I want to articulate here is that if I have a vertical strap or a piece of rope that's single, if I pull on it, every point in the rope, from this point all the way down to where it's connected to the load, here, 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 every instance in that rope has to have the same tension in it. It can't be different somewhere else. It has to have equal tension. And so if I apply a 1 kilonewton force to it, it's 1 kilonewton here, 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 here. It doesn't matter. It can't be a different tension throughout the rope. I hope everybody can see that and understand that. Same as if I deflect the rope slightly. The tension has to be the same throughout the rope, all the way from where the load input is to where it's being pulled on the load. The tension has to be equal throughout the whole rope. Where we have a single strand, if you're dealing with chain or you're dealing with a wire cable, that's what's called a vertical bridle. But if we double it over and we create a basket, the same principle applies. The tension in the rope has to be equal all the way through the whole piece of rope. So if I apply a 1 kilonewton load here and I pass the rope around a pulley or around an object and I anchor it on the other side, the tension here, 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 all the way through the rope, including this little magical point right here that everybody sees, and everything your redneck sense inside of you says, but it's the single point that should be weaker. It's 1 kilonewton right there, and all the way through back to the anchor. And so we know just from our technical rescue backgrounds that if we have 1 kilonewton on this side, I'll have 1 kilonewton on this side, and I can apply how much force at the end? 2 kilonewtons. So that is our 2-to-1 mechanical advantage. And that is how mechanical advantage is created, is based on that principle. But the key that you have to keep in mind for the purposes of a vertical bridle versus a basket is that the rope has to have the same tension throughout. It can't be a different amount of tension in a different point. And that includes this magical little black magic piece here, that somehow the physics allow this 2 kilonewton load to distribute equally through the rope and to have 1 kilonewton on each side. So that's how it doubles. I want to emphasize that point because it's the crux of this video. The load is equally distributed by all the strands that are supporting it. So in this case, we've got 2 ropes that are supporting the load. And so at that magical point right at the pulley, the load equally distributes between the 2 strands, and thus the rope only has to support 1 kilonewton on each side and all the way throughout it. And the same can be said in reverse. You take multiple strands that support the load, and you take its single strand strength and multiply it by the number of strands, and it becomes that much stronger. A good example of that is a webbing basket hitch that we use in technical rescue that has 4 strands of webbing, and it becomes 4 times the strength of a single strand of webbing. So that's the principle at play, is that the load equally distributes between all strands. All right, so there's an element that's interrelated to this topic, and that's the D to D ratio. And the D to D is the dimension or diameter of this object compared to the diameter of this object. Okay, that's the D to D ratio. If this object is too narrow, you get a sharp bend in whatever this material is, and you weaken the strength of it. If it's big enough, then you distribute the load equally all the way around the dimension of that object. So let's take a look at the D to D ratio here. So this is, as I just described, kind of drawn out here. And if you look at heavy rigging manuals, you'll see the D as a big D for the object you're wrapped around, and then a little d as in the material that you're working with, whether it's wire rope, nylon rope, chain, webbing, any of those kind of things. So the way this principle works is as you wrap this object, if you look and you think of it, I like to think of it as like a rescue rope, because that's what we work with the most. As I wrap it around this object, the outside part of this rope is under tension. The inside part of this rope is actually under compression. And so the sharper that bend is, the more tension I have on this outside portion of the rope, and the more compression I have on the inside part of the rope. Whereas if I make this object really big, like if I wrap an 11 millimeter rope around a 10-inch tree, it's got a big D to D ratio, and the rope gently goes around in a big arc. And that is how our tensionless hitches retain almost full strength of the rope, is because we have a big D to D. Alternatively, if we think about a knot, it has very sharp bends, it has bad D to D, and that's where our knots are weak, is where it bends inside the rope. And so you have extra tension on the outsides and you have compression on the inside, and it causes the rope to be weaker at that point. And so this D to D is an important aspect to think about. And so if we think about that in terms of some different materials we use quite a bit, our rescue rope, the ones we use here in AFD, are polyester. Same applies with nylon. A common D to D to retain 100% of its strength is around 10 to 1. And if you think about our pulleys, those pulleys are based on a 4 to 1 D to D ratio. They're an 1 3/4 sheave and a 7/16 inch rope. And with that D to D ratio, you have roughly around a 15% strength loss in the rope, which is an acceptable margin when we're working with the rope, and it falls within our safety factors. Chain has a 6 to 1 D to D to retain 100% of its strength, and wire rope has a 25 to 1 D to D. So as you can tell, the different materials have different D to Ds. And so you can look at rigging handbooks and those kind of things to find out what material you're working with and what its D to D ratio is. And so some familiarity with that would be a good idea. So let's think about that in terms of like say a heavy rigging situation where maybe I've got a box truck and I've got a couple wheels here, a couple wheels here, axle running through the middle. One person might say, okay, if I take a chain and I sling this thing and I sling it up, I've got 8,800 on this side and 8,800 on this side. Well, that's a total of, what is that, 17,600 pounds. So that's what our chain is good for. But the problem with that is if we think about our axles are around 17,000 pounds a piece, which means I have a total of 34,000 pounds that I need to support in the back end of a fully loaded trailer. 34,000 doesn't go into 17. That's why for a long time I have proposed to do a chain loop here, where a chain loop you have 2 strands of chain. That 2 strands based on all this D to D ratio, as long as your D to D is good, and based on the principle of a vertical choker where you're or not choker, but a vertical bridle where you're spreading that load between 2 chains, that essentially gives me 17,600 on this side, 17,600 on this side, for a total of 35,200. Which falls within the 34,000 pounds that the back end of a fully loaded trailer would need to support. So a basket on the back end of a fully loaded truck with duals in the back is no go. You're gonna have to do multiple strands of chain on both sides to be able to support that load. So understanding these principles of vertical versus basket allows you to make these kind of decisions in the field. All right, so here's our setup. We've got shackle on each side. We've got good D to D ratio between our 550 cord and our shackle. We're gonna load it up. We'll capture our peak force here. This is just to make sure that when it breaks, we don't fly the shackle back towards the rescue. All right, tension. Just go all the way. Max force, 556 pounds. Nice. All right, here's the setup this time. We've got 2 strands. It's just made a big loop. We've put the 550 cord onto the shackle, and understand we're pulling this shackle sideways, not like it's meant to be. but it's way overrated for that. But we've got good D to D here, we've got good D to D here. So we pull it up, and the principle should be that it should break twice as strong as a single strand. All right, Marcus, hit it. Peak force, 1120. So right at twice. Savvy?